Okay. Good evening. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining the first in person event at the School Cities in nearly 2 years. We made it. So, I'm Karen Chappell. I'm director of the School Cities at the University of Toronto. We like to say we teach the world why cities matter for inclusion, prosperity, justice, and sustainability. We see cities as offering the solution to complex challenges. We connect the university to the community locally and globally by mobilizing knowledge across disciplines and building capacities to co create social change. We're very happy tonight to be welcoming the Center for Cities and Schools from the University of California at Berkeley for the launch of their first book, Planning Cities with Young People in Schools. Note that the Center for Cities and Schools is almost School of Cities backwards. So we see tonight as an event to connect the world of urban studies and planning to education, which is a mission we both share at our centers, forwards and backwards. And we see it as a way also to bring this very important work to Toronto so we can start to do youth engagement and planning in a meaningful way here. So I want to begin with a land acknowledgement. We wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to share the opportunity to work on this land. So a couple housekeeping items for those in the audience. For those online, you can submit questions anytime through the comment function on Vimeo. Copies of the book are available for sale at the U of T bookstore or any fine bookstore near you. So this is a fabulous book. I know because I had the privilege of reading an early draft of it. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the book in a minute, but first I'd like to introduce our speakers. So it's with the greatest pleasure that I introduce to you Dr. Deb Mccoy. Deb is the executive director and founder of the UC Berkeley Center for Cities and Schools, and she's taught at the Department of City and Regional Planning and the Graduate School of Education at UC Berkeley for 20 years, touching the lives of thousands of students. She came to academia from a professional background in housing, economic development, and refugee services in New York City. Her research and teaching focuses on the intersection of educational reform, urban planning, community development, and public policy. Central to her work is the critical role young people play in urban and metropolitan change and transformation. And because I know that you will all question her Canadian credentials, I'd like to add that her partner and her children are Canadian citizens. So Mandy Eppley and Cheryl Buss are co-authors of the book. They couldn't be with us tonight in person, but I'll be introducing them a bit later on online as they join us for the panel. Professor Jim Slotta has kindly agreed to be our discussant tonight. Jim is professor and president's chair in knowledge technologies at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the U of T. Since 2005, he's led a team of students, designers, and developers to investigate new models of collaborative and collective inquiry in K-12 science, including powerful new roles for technology-enhanced learning environments. Building on a background in physics and cognitive psychology, and how cool is that, he has developed a pedagogical model known as knowledge community inquiry, in which students investigate a phenomenon or issue within a carefully scripted and orchestrated sequence of learning activities. Jim is currently developing a new generation of network technologies to support future learning spaces through social, tangible, and embodied interactions. Welcome, Jim. So let me talk briefly about cities and young people before turning the mic over to Deb. Cities are the laboratories from which democracy, culture, and innovation emerge. But despite their opportunities and their vitality, there's a darker reality of entrenched inequality fueled by segregation. When neighborhoods are segregated by race and by income, children often end up in segregated schools and may not be able to fulfill their potential in life. In the US, this is compounded by the fiscal structure of education, where schools in affluent districts tend to spend much more per pupil than those in disadvantaged areas. Urban planning sees itself as an interdisciplinary field that translates knowledge into action to produce more just and inclusive cities. Urban planning has a lot to learn from education. So the most cited article by far in urban planning ever is Sherry Arnstein's 1969 A Ladder of Citizen Participation. Arnstein pointed out that planners were often substituting token strategies of consultation instead of having meaningful partnership and power sharing. And sadly, this is still true today. So enter the Y Plan. Youth Plan, Learn, Action Now. Y Plan brings a truly interdisciplinary and empowering strategy. This book that you'll hear about tonight tells the story of Y Plan and makes the case for how integrating young people into planning processes weaves justice and joy into the urban fabric. So why do we need this now? Well, we're in the middle of a crisis of housing precarity, transportation systems are on the brink of collapse, and climate change threatens the planet itself. Thankfully, Deb, Mandy, and Cheryl come together to show how youth apply their lived experience of housing, transportation, climate, and other challenges to develop and implement creative visions. Their strategy has proven its effectiveness across many different contexts. So this book will inspire you by showing how, by listening to our young people, we'll begin to co-create cities that belong to all of us. So, welcome, Deb.
Hello, and thank you so much, Karen, and everybody at the School for Cities for hosting our very first book talk and discussion. As Karen said, this is not only exciting to be here to launch our book, but it also is very exciting to do it so here in Toronto, Canada, where, as you said, my husband and family are from. So it is very much also a second home to me. So now on to our book. Planning cities with young people and schools, forging justice and generating joy, aims to bring the critical role and perspective of young people from low-income communities of color in their public schools to how we plan for cities for the future as well as for today. While published in Routledge's City Planning Division, our hope is to present a set of best practice recommendations for planners, urbanists, civic and community leaders, and educators to change the status quo and reimagine the future of our cities for and with young people. Our book shares powerful insights gained from working with over 10,000 students over 2 decades, from San Francisco to New York to Tohoku, Japan, and beyond. Part 1 presents a theory of change for planning more equitable, youth-friendly cities by cultivating what we call intergenerational communities of practice, where young people work alongside city planners and adult professionals. Part 2 explores 9 case studies and youth engagement in core areas of planning through an analysis of literature and international examples of engaging children and youth in planning. Part 3 speaks directly to practitioners, scholars, and students alike, presenting what we refer to as the 6 essentials for planning just and joyful cities. We recognize these essentials as necessary precursors for effective and meaningful and sustainable city planning. I would, in all honesty, like to add that while we are very grateful and happy that the book is finally in print, right? So I've heard it's actually at home now. I don't have the physical copy. This work is very much a work in progress. We hope tonight to catalyze a conversation that we can continue into the future, learning, sharing our work, but also really importantly, learning more about the work here in Toronto and in other cities across the nation and globe, who really we have to all learn from each other in order to move this work forward. While I am up here today in person, I am beyond humbled and proud to also introduce my two co-authors that Karen already referenced, that I've had the privilege of working with for also nearly 20 years. Mandy Eppley has served for the past 6 years as our Deputy Director of the Center for Cities and Schools, but our time together dates even before that, as Mandy was one of my first graduate students in city planning. She came back to this center from teaching in public schools for many years in 2015 to serve as our center's Director of Y-Plan Initiatives and then Deputy Director. Dr. Cheryl Buss was one of my very first partners in this work of listening and learning how to lift up voices of our youngest residents, and served as a professor of architecture, as well as our current center's creative director, what she has done for over a decade. Both Amanda and Cheryl are here with us today virtually and will be available for questions during the discussion period. At the opening of the book, Karen Chappell reminds us how, as she has just said, urban planning sees itself as an interdisciplinary field that translates knowledge into action. A point that she also references that is equally as important is that key to doing so and realizing so many of the lofty goals of, I would say, progressive city planning is also understanding whose knowledge and vision should inform our cities. And equally as important, how do we begin to incorporate diverse voices into how we plan and develop our cities? So I'll now turn to part one of our book, setting a context and theoretical framework for engaging young people in planning. It explores two central tenets that we found through all the literature as truly the common denominator in so much of our work. In concert with authentic youth engagement, particularly though not exclusively, working with low-income students of color in our most marginalized communities, as well as their public schools. As we do in each chapter, we begin with a vignette to situate our analysis in the voices and insights of young planners, working together with adults from everywhere from working on sidewalks to bus stops to being at mayor's offices and boardrooms at City Hall. In our analysis, we pored over and examined several hundred of these examples of youth engagement in planning. As we examined our own work, we also investigated extensive literature on progressive notions of planning and education. In so doing, we present a theory and practice together to offer a research-driven, interdisciplinary lens and theory of change to which more effectively reimagine and design our cities. As young people and adults work together in authentic intergenerational communities of practice, they disrupt stereotypes and assumptions about how young people learn, how they access and experience people and places in their neighborhoods, and then how they work together to begin to navigate their cities in different and new ways. Ultimately, navigating and learning more and having greater access to people and places and experiences, they together learn how they can transform their communities. This graphic reflects each of these core dimensions of our theory of change. It is important to understand this work as more of an interactive or dialectic process, reflecting the reciprocal and dynamic nature of young people working with adults in learning to be agents of change. Our book Insights and Theory of Change builds from a deep analysis of many planning projects driven by what Karen introduced as the Y-Plan, civic learning, and community engagement methodology. I was very happy to hear you use the acronym of Youth Plan, Learn, Act Now. because this often becomes somewhat of a saying and mantra for many of the students who get engaged in the work. But tonight, I also want to introduce this concept as a concept, and what we would say a pun, about inviting each of us to step back from an urban perspective, from an education perspective, and what the young people are invited to do, ask why. Why are cities driven by such painful inequalities that exist today? Why is one city block so much more inviting and safer than another just 2 or 3 blocks away? Why do some young people have access to high quality, affordable homes with good transit options, right? While others live crammed together, families of 6 doubled up in 2 bedrooms who have to walk often over a mile just to get to a bus stop in order to get to school or work on time. What began as a discreet 4-week volunteer project in West Oakland in California in 2000 has grown to reach over 36 cities across the United States and over 10 countries. Through Y-Plan, students across the academic trajectory plan to learn while learning to plan. Here on this slide, on the left, you will see young elementary school students working with the city of San Francisco on affordable housing development, a project partnership that now extends over 11 years, led by the vision and brilliance of my co-author, Dr. Cheryl Buss. On the right is a young man from Brooklyn High School presenting recommendations to the New York City Department of Homeless Services on how to improve college and career readiness for students in temporary housing. A 5-year partnership led by our other brilliant co-author, Mandy Eppley. Below are images of Y-planners, as we like to say, investigating environmental hazards and resilience from local Chevron oil refinery in Richmond, California, to flooding in neighboring Marin. Another central concept to the theory and practice of engaging young people in our cities is understanding such practices and bringing diverse participants in higher education, K-12, and the civic community together as an intergenerational community of practice. As many here may know, this is a social theory of learning that for us uniquely bridges the typically siloed fields of city planning and education. As posited by Leib and Wenger in 1993, also from Berkeley, the concept of community of practice relies on the notion that learning is inherently social and participatory, and that educational activities must engage young people as learning communities to achieve a larger impact. It is also important to note that communities of practice are not static entities, but a reflection of shared practices and relationships that evolve over time. Each stakeholder or community member also brings unique expertise to this work. While subtle, it is really important that we don't think of participants of any age, young or older adults, as a quote expert, but as individuals bringing valued and distinctive insights and a range of expertise to the work. For example, higher education can bring college mentors, best practices, college and career readiness, and rigor. K-12 brings what we want so much in planning of lived experiences, fresh perspectives, hopes and possibilities, and ideas to the planning table. Civic and community partners can leverage real power, professional practices, policy-making experiences, money, resources, and more. In our book, we focus on 3 core areas where we have seen young people have real impact in planning. While not exclusive, we focus on transportation, housing, and resilience. To ensure any public school can adapt and implement Y-Plan partnerships and initiatives, we at the Center have spent a long time developing extensive models and curricula aligned to major national and state educational standards and pedagogical teaching models. We will look to Jim for the response to how these also translate here in Canada and to Toronto. To guide this learning process is what we call the 5-step roadmap to change. I will briefly walk through these 5 steps, but there's lots of detail and cases behind all of this in our book. So step 1 is start up. Young people get to know each other and their strengths. What's really important about Y-Plan is that it starts actually with a real problem, a community or a civic leader that not only has a problem for young people to tackle and solve, but the power and resources to use the students' ideas. This work cannot be a simulation. If we emphasize nothing else today in this process, is the critical nature of real, authentic work to engage young people with, right? So step 1. Once they have the problem and get a sense of the work as well as their team, they go into step 2, making sense of the city. Here, it's where they collect data, they do community mapping, they do interviews in the community, and they begin the analysis process, right? From the analysis, they go into step 3, into action. In planning and design, we call this the charrette process, right? Working in small groups, the young people generate new ideas that they learn from their data, evidence-based ideas, right? Because it's working from data, and propose new solutions and action plans. We like to say that it's not enough to come up with ideas. Change comes from when you can communicate those ideas, right? So we have to support young people in going public. And that's phase 4, right? Increasingly, not surprisingly, like tonight, we go public in person as well as online. An interesting thing from last year, over 800 young people we managed to still engage in Y-Plan online and distance learning, right? Of course, we miss the in-person piece that will never go and change, and we're excited to engage in that again. But what was amazing is that we nearly doubled the numbers of civic partners and community leaders, adults, who could join the final presentations to not only hear the students' work, but engage in dialogue, going into small discussion groups and breakout rooms, right? So while we are excited to go back in person, we really don't want to let go of some of that opportunity that the virtual environment provided. After the presentation, what happens? Next, stage 5 is really critically important about reflection, right? They say an educational experience isn't educational unless you reflect on what did we learn, what went well, often more importantly, what didn't go well, right? That tends to be what inspires new ideas. So it's really critical. We look at an individual level about how young people can foster, how this can help young people foster college, career, and community readiness, but at the same time, how adults and the folks doing the planning and community development, how we can use these insights to really create and foster just and joyful cities. A frequent question that we get from teachers and professionals alike is, well, okay, you've done this work. How do you know you've done a good job, right? What makes for a high quality project? Well, we developed this quality framework for shared impact to try to help make that clearer. This includes analysis along our 2 key dimensions of Y-Plan projects, or honestly, any youth engagement project that's similar, right? It's not just ours. It really should be reflective of any type of similar work. Number 1 is that Y-Plan, right, okay, so the first area that we look at are how much do projects reflect lived experience, the degree to which students, peers, family members, and community experiences are incorporated in the projects that get presented. Second is the degree that this work also reflects professional practices, right? And that such things such as data and maps, even professional terms and language, are really important for students to have ownership, not just of their ideas, but that their ideas, like we would in urban planning or urban studies classrooms, right, that you use data and evidence to support your ideas from the field and the practice of planning and community engagement, right? So professional practices is critical. We consider the ultimate goal that in engaging young people in planning to kind of reach the highest quadrant, as you can see in the corner up there, right, that reflects truly potential for transformative change. And we feel that that's the highest when young people really are able to express high levels of lived experience and professional practice. Okay, Now moving from theory to practice is part 2 of our book. In the book, we present 9 case studies of youth engaging with adults in planning focused on resilience, housing, and transportation. In the interest of time, I will describe one of these case studies in housing today, and then followed by a short video that builds, a documentary video that builds on this work and extends it from a regional perspective. I wish that our youth planners could be here today, but I hope that this video brings some of their work and this process to life tonight with you all. Each case study includes an analysis of how it demonstrated the key aspects of our theory of change and exemplify how youth planners' interest in finding ways to achieve both justice and joy in their communities. As communities and cities throughout North America, here as well as down in the States, the cities continue to gentrify and families are displaced. This is especially salient in the San Francisco Bay Area, Silicon Valley, the heart of high tech, where salaries are super crazy high, pricing out our low-income communities of color that have long thrived in these neighborhoods. In a small city of East Palo Alto, we worked with a school known as Epappa, a small charter school that welcomed a partnership with local government leaders and Facebook, an unlikely project partner for us, to engage with this critical topic. A STEM science teacher embraced housing as a part of studying the environment by engaging in actual housing research with none other than Karen Chappell, here now at Toronto, who invited us to bring young people into not only the process of planning, but research on actual housing. The students worked over 2 years in a range of capacities and differing partnerships, brainstorming in small teams what could be done to address the devastating loss of affordable housing so many of them felt so personally. After collecting data and gathering evidence, students' collaborative work yielded a range of recommendations, including right-sized housing, policy supports, and community building efforts. With Facebook and city government as partners, it seems only logical that they would come up with many private-public types of recommendations and solutions to the housing crisis. First, students lobbied for right-sized housing through tiny homes on vacant land, and similarly sized ADUs as well as small condos with support for low-income, local, first-time homeowners. They would often question why these individuals who work in the high-tech companies and are never at home had all these giant apartments. They're like, we need the giant apartments because we have such large families, right? Students also called for policy supports, including rent control, anti-harassment laws, financing programs for low-income, local home buyers, and home repair funds for the elderly. Young people are always thinking about intergenerational issues when they get involved in planning processes. In this case study, youth research and leadership has had a sustained impact on policymakers' decision over time. Facebook invested over $1 million in new ADU developments. Probably could have spent $20 million, but at least they invested something on the students' ideas. And relationships continued beyond the project even last year through COVID, when we got a call, I think around April in the spring of 2021, inviting the young people to present in Menlo Park City Hall, present their recommendations via Zoom to the City Council when they're reviewing their housing policy changes. Only by forging relationships and professional and social networks such as this can we truly begin to transcend race, class, income, and educational attainment, where we begin to develop a movement necessary to unravel centuries of segregation, racism, and displacement. Building on this case study, I am really excited to share a short video documentary that expands on this work in East Palo Alto, reaching 9 counties across the Bay Area, focused on resilience. And I'm not in charge of the video.
in a place that's bounded by water, it's characterized by water. We know that the climate is changing, sea levels are rising. We live in a place where there are other stresses, including inequities in economy, in means, in social access. And we need to think about how we can make a more just, equitable, environmentally resilient world.
Resilient by Design was a one-year challenge in the Bay Area where they brought together teams of professionals, experts, and regional agencies to try to address the impacts of climate change. But they were missing that community and youth component. And so through Y-Plan, they were able to go into classes and really get to learn from students and young people what are the issues that they were facing every day, and what does that have to do with our long-term vision for the region around climate change.
Some things I don't want to change in East Palo Alto are places like the Baylands, in which people may not see the use or beauty of it right away, but if you live around there and you know its like actual purpose, it's such a helpful part of EPA. It's important to realize and understand where you are and that you're not the first one to be there. There's people or creatures, like living organisms, that have been there before you, and to like move in and just start taking over land, it's doing to them what you feel is unjustly being done to you.
For Y-Plan, we went on a field trip to a place where no one in Richmond really knows about, not even us if they didn't introduce it to us through the program. We went as a class and we observed the land, and we came up with our own ideas to innovate what we think the area should be.
In the 1960s through 1980s, when a lot of freeways were being built, it cut off a lot of our communities from those natural routes. So unfortunately, a lot of our younger generation has lost an identity that is really important.
When the young people were asked, why resilience is important for them, I think they were really pushing to think about how can that city that they live in today be a city that they can see themselves in long term. Having a resilient region really means a region that allows for those opportunities to be here, home, where they're already living.
Before Y-Plan, I was not aware of the potential our city had. I was just ready to get up and leave Richmond, go somewhere else. I wasn't thinking of ways to, innovate our city into making it something good, into making it something positive for our community and the people that live here.
Their experience is their gift. The projects they work on, the spaces that they design, the amenities that they ask for, when we're able to show them that their voice created it, I really feel like it's not just if you build it, they will come, but if they build it, they will come back.
Government does not care about Oakland. It takes all of Oakland's community to even get the government's attention. And even with government's attention, that don't mean nothing.
At first, I was really mad about Y-Plan. Really didn't want to participate in it because I was this is just another form of gentrification. But that was without me thinking about the actual power I had and what I could bring to the table and be able to help Oakland's community a lot more.
Kodo is a phenomenal student. He has so many opinions and he has this trove of experience that is not accessed in traditional ways through the traditional education system. There's a lot of changes happening in Oakland, and they are the perfect people to actually go and develop plans of action that don't leave behind these communities.
Many of the youth experience some of these challenges in our communities firsthand, and so they bring such great insights and knowledge to how we need to address some of these bigger climate challenges that we have before us.
It actually gave me a platform to voice my opinion and use my voice to see a change that I felt was necessary and could actually help my community in a positive way.
It feels really important to us because they're asking us. I noticed that students are waking up to the fact that, this is an actual conflict that we have to face, and that since they're directly talking to us, we're the ones who create change.
we come up with design, but then ultimately, how do we actually implement these ideas in our community? This opportunity to open up people's imagination is really how we start to get to solutions.
The young people's lived experience in the Bay Area is really the missing link that we need to address in order to create and build a resilient Bay Area.
So many times, and it's still just a great reminder of the young people we've worked with. They're terrific. Okay, so I will begin to conclude my talk today by addressing a second very frequently asked question in this work. So what happens next, right? The students do a project, they engage, they present their work. What happens next? Well, part 3 of our book presents a call to action, calling on planners and policymakers today to recognize that we will never realize our highest aspiration to incorporate power and promise of young people, schools, educators, and they must be incorporated into this process. Our analysis of 20 years of on-the-ground work with literally thousands of young people and partners has led us to what we refer to as the 6 essentials for planning just and joyful cities. We offer these as a foundation to guide city planning, policymaking for all of us, not just those empowered with the positions currently, but for all of us to think about our collaborative work moving forward. I'll go through each of these briefly. We go into more of these, of course, in depth in the book with case studies behind each of these areas. First, basic needs. Attend to first things first. Many young people live with fear and insecurity and uncertainty. They have experienced violence, displacement, and instability. We find that while they are more willing to engage in long-term planning and thinking, we must first also acknowledge the current conditions and ensure that we also address the current basic needs of all residents. Next, mutual understanding. Deep and respectful listening on the part of adults creates a climate of dignified mutuality and opens the door for productive two-way conversations, right? Where adults are truly listening to young people, and young people then also get to listen to adults in very different ways. Trust and relationship. Take the time needed to build genuine relationships for trust and embrace the tensions that often develop in the process. One of the most interesting things about this work is it's when things are uncomfortable, when these tensions come up around displacement that are hard for adults in power to talk about because they feel responsible often. Those tensions are where the magic happens. It's where the real respect and trust can come from. One meeting or one event will never do the trick. From my time in New York City government, when we'd be sent out to do our checklist of get community engagement, which is very much more often a community information session than an engagement session, right? In order to build trust and relationships, it must be over time and multiple times of meeting each other. Power of all ages. This often surprises people. Engaging across the entire age spectrum deepens discourse and cultivates civic capacity. We're often asked, well, is it elementary or middle school? What's the sweet spot for engaging students, right? We have found across the years that there is powerful contributions from second graders, middle schoolers, high schools, and I teach the same work at UC Berkeley for many years, right? It's also disciplinary. This work has been in STEM classes. About half of our projects are STEM related, but the other half are humanities, English, social studies, even a cooking class in New York City that brilliantly got engaged in this work and started recognizing the importance of cooking in homeless shelters, right? The power of food in working with communities. Responsibility. Professionalize partnerships with real tools. Students of all ages are capable of analyzing data, creating models, maps, employing technical vocabulary, and providing leadership to help contemporary urban challenges. I think it was very surprising when we were working in Palo Alto that kids love spatial data. They love clipboards with maps and really being able to walk around the same way urban planners do, right? Again, not a simulation, but authentic practice. Finally, connectivity. Structuring access to decision makers and places of power for young people leverages their ability to serve as powerful connectors between institutions in ways that you would never believe until you're in the process of doing it. Planners and educators, housers, so many different folks who are responsible for the change in our cities. It's amazing they actually change their disposition and become much more willing to engage in conversations when young people are at the table. Young people are amazing connectors, and we need them to do this work. We end our book today and my talk with a call to action. In Karen Chappell's foreword, she truly sums up so much of what we aim to do, hopefully beginning tonight and moving forward. It is our hope that by listening to young people, we begin to co-create cities that truly belong to all of us. Thank you. Okay, Jim? Okay, I am now very proud and happy to introduce a dear friend and colleague who I worked with in Berkeley and is now professor here in Toronto, Professor Jim Slaughter.
Well, hi everybody. I'm going to take this off. Massive face-to-face audience we have here. I'm grateful for every one of you. This is a new normal, but hopefully we'll see an increasing crowd size as time goes on. Yeah, my name's Jim Slaughter. Being a discussant is always interesting. You're asked for opinions, you're asked for engagement, you're asked for connections, and you're usually asked to do it in something slightly outside your comfort zone. So I've been learning about this, reading of the book and talking a lot with Deb and Karen. Just honored that I'd be invited to serve this role. As all the people that might have been invited from the School of Education, there are a number of others that would have been great in this. I have some things that I can say, and I have some things that I'm doing now that are actually not dissimilar from this. So I don't have slides. They asked me if I had slides. I'm just gonna read follow a few notes along here and try to give a bit of perspective, particularly on how this can connect to the world of education. Deb, Dr. McCoy, she points to origins in education, and I think a lot of what you saw up here speaks to education. But the discipline of education can push on this, and it can make a lot of interesting connections, and it can pry open some things that I think when you just watch the video, it looks like this is a pretty solved problem, and why aren't we just doing this, right? So we can speak to some of that. But first, I want to start by acknowledging what she alluded to, is that I have known Deb for a long time, and it's so great to watch this project, which I moved here to Toronto in 2005. So we're talking at least 20 years ago that I started learning about YPlan, and watching her so excited when she was a young scholar and a postdoc, and then moving up through her career to build this project to what you see it right now. It really is, I was impressed then, and I'm impressed now. I look back through my CV and I found in 2003, I was teaching a course on sustainable and appropriate development in the School of Engineering, and invited Deb in to be a guest speaker and represent, her new ideas then about youth engaged design. So it's been a while, and so maybe that's another good reason that they would invite me to give this presentation, because I've been familiar with this work, and hopefully today I can offer just a little bit about of my perspective. But first, I want to start by saying a few things about the Y Plan. These are not common success stories. You have to look, far and wide to find 20-year success stories that engage multiple disciplines, that can engage the community, that produce legitimate experiences from students, and that you could pull a group of students in and they would underscore and probably even add to the story that was told up here. So this is legitimate, and I think that's something that we as educators should look carefully at whenever you find something that works. That's probably in cities too, right? Authentic engagement. I think that was stressed in the talk, and I think that's stressed in our field of education studies, curriculum studies. This is the kind of experience that brings meaning and purpose to students. I think you'll find meaning and purpose is one of the things lacking for many students. Randy Engel, a former Berkeley colleague, had a concept she called productive disciplinary engagement. And this is a project that really brings that productive disciplinary engagement across a number of disciplines, mapping, data, presentations. There's 21st century skills, which you hear as being sort of critical importance to the world, connections to content. But I think even more important is the empowerment that students get through the voice, through their, the authenticity of their voice being engaged in this. And that's really where this approach gets a lot of its strength. And just to point out that way before the current, the prominence of the theme of culturally relevant and inclusive curriculum, which is wonderful that this is happening, and many of us are learning more and more about this, but way before that was happening, this kind of thing was happening. So it's actually been I'm sure, an icebreaker and a groundbreaker for that kind of work. For me, maybe most importantly in the Y Plan, I see the 5-stage roadmap. I looked at it again during your talk. I'm really interested as a scholar in student identity formation, because I have a 15-year-old and a 10-year-old of my own, and I'm watching them, and I'm really curious how they are coming to understand themselves in the world. Why are they in school? What do they want to do? How are they going to find that out? Through Instagram, through YouTube, and through their friends. And hopefully school can start presenting something that makes sense to these kids. They see Greta Thunberg, they see the marching in the Queen's Park, and they really are asking questions of what this is all about, and why is school so weird, just so weirdly disconnected, right? And that's incumbent on us to take this seriously and bring that into the schools. And so that's something I'll talk to you I'm going to watch my time. I told you the 5 minutes. So, but I'm dwelling on iPlan because this is the real reason we're here. And the last point I want to make about it is that yes, it gives to students all of this, but wow, it gives maybe to cities even more when you think about it from the planning perspective, to have that as a kind of feed, hopefully one that you talk about lived experience. What's the lived experience of city planners? If they come to feel that as being really important, that's not going to go away. They're going to want more of that, right? And that's what this community practice thing is about, is that suddenly that'll become in their mind something that is the kind of thing that one does when one's planning cities. It's the kind of information that we need. So that's just a really critical point there, that this is, it's also about student learning. But I want to just go to educational research for a minute. When something like Y Plan bubbles up out of the world, I think it is incumbent on us to have a look at it and to think about it. And I think this is where educational research can come in. These kind of approaches that you see here are very nuanced. And you may not see that in the appropriately glossed over presentations, but to get teachers to pull this off, it takes a marriage almost. It takes a deep, sustained commitment. It takes meetings and meetings and meetings. It probably takes several, trials and iterations, and everyone's going to come out different. And honestly, there's lots of opportunity that we see for student engagement and growth, but it doesn't necessarily have to go well, right? It's not easy to engage all the students meaningfully, deeply, all the time. You need expert and timely interactions with the students. You need to have sensitivity to how to engage their voice and read them. You need to connect them to these partners. It's not a really well-solved problem. And so, we need to study when we find those things that work. And I think, my group has been doing this. I'm not going to be able to go deeply into the work that we're doing. I'll mention it, but we've been spending a bit of time ourselves trying to help teachers learn how to do this kind of critical action, and what we call it, critical pedagogy. It's a tough assignment for teachers, especially if you don't want it to be just a little supplemental thing, a kind of co-curricular thing. If you want that to be the way that you teach, that's a tough shift in practice, and it honestly takes professional development. And again, it's not well understood. It's not like we know what we have to do. We are still researching and learning about what are students learning actually, and how are teachers even enacting and approaching this kind of experience. So I think educational research can bring some of our methods and some of our talented PhD students, a few here in the audience, to bear on these problems, to understand them more deeply, to create professional development pathways, to take an example like Y-Plan and actually expose it and have a more critical look at it, and maybe to form partnerships with them and go forward, which we have talked about doing, and with the City of Schools as well. So, just one quick example from my group is we're building a critical action community for teachers to do this kind of work. In Ontario here, it's focused on climate action. So we have what's called a professional learning community for teachers, hoping to support them in designing these kind of activities, not necessarily youth planning, but engaged critical action kind of curriculum, and to, in the Oakland community, to focus on climate action, so as not to just try to explain to you how doomed we are, right? That kind of education could actually unsettle you and make you anxious. And, that's not the kind of empowerment and identity formation we're looking for. But how does a teacher pull that off? Again, not a solved problem. So it's workshops, and it's study, and it's co-design, and it's a professional learning community. And that's what we're building. And I think that is one place that we've spoken with Director Chappell about bringing, the same sort of relationship. We could really benefit from a School of Cities community. We probably have a lot to offer as well. So that's what I'm hoping can go forward. CALE has now grown to include international groups in China and India. And it's been a lot of fun, is one word for it, to help communities of teachers build these kind of curriculum efforts in those remote regions. And we're still making progress on that. So I'm going to kind of wrap here and just note the serendipity of my group moving into this critical area, and then reconnecting with Deb's effort and her friend and colleague moving to the city. It's just a wonderful coincidence that I believe those things can actually be very important moments. I think the School of Cities brings that kind of intersection of multiple disciplines: planning, education, geography, architecture, business, humanities. And it is the kind of place on campus that probably is where the university should put its bets. I would say the university is problematic in the kind of silos that we keep and maintain. And if we want this place to become relevant and to stay relevant, I think it's going to be groups like this one that play an important role in drawing those disciplines in, finding the boundary objects, and allowing those kind of exchanges. So I'm thankful to Director Chappell, School of Cities, for organizing this. I certainly hope we remain connected. I also just want to mention that OISE has many possible connections, including potentially the pre-service program. We have a credentialing program for teachers that could benefit from this kind of thing, or We have a Center for Urban Schooling, leadership and policy. So there's a lot of potential. And internationally, I think your group is going to help Toronto stay connected within a wider network of scholarship and innovation related to the role of cities in a sustainable and equitable future. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much, Jim. That's we really look forward to working closely with OISE in the future. And now I want to call up our panel. And while I'm doing that, I will introduce our two urban studies students. So we have, go ahead and take your seats. So we have Raluca Jampana. She's in her 4th year. An undergraduate majoring in urban studies and equity studies. She's particularly interested in theories of feminist geography, community engaged learning, equity centered transit planning, and anti colonial studies in the West. She hopes to pursue graduate studies in Toronto on planning or public policy. So, welcome, Raluca. So great to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us. And I'd also like to introduce Juana Seifel. Juana is in her 3rd year as an undergraduate, majoring in urban studies and human geography with planning and GIS. Juana hails from Brunei, which is dominated by car culture, apparently, and she will talk about that a bit. So she's inspired to learn from the case studies here of youth civic engagement and identify how this could be applied to her home country. So thank you both for joining. So did you want to proceed with some questions for Deb?
Yeah, sure. I can go first. My first question, I was really interested in the East Palo Alto case study, specifically about the public-private partnership, like with Facebook. I was wondering, could you elaborate more on like the benefits and drawbacks of having a public-private partnership?
Yes, and we have a special treat tonight, which is that we should be turning over to our co-authors if our technology is going to work right. Can we have Dr. Cheryl Buss respond? Are we set up for that? Hey, there you are. Hey, got to hear you. Yay.
Hello, everyone. We had suggested that Karen and Deb take this one on since you're intimately involved in the Facebook experience. So thank you.
Okay, back to us. I'm so excited this is working. Great. Okay, so I think the project that Karen and I worked on is actually a really good example of public-private partnership that you're talking about. But you're right, it is vulnerable, right, to when so much money like Silicon Valley is in the room, it is hard for them not to dominate the conversation, right? I think what was so important was sometimes public processes can work, right? I still believe in public processes. And one of those in our cities are community benefit agreements, right? So one of the things that Facebook had to do, not as a tech mogul, but as a developer, they're building enormous amounts, Facebook and Google are building enormous amounts of new buildings. And in order to get it passed by the community, they actually had to go to the community and say what they were going to give back, right? We're not just going to build housing for our overpaid, workers. We have to give something back. And so that was a housing study of Karen. Do you want to say anything briefly on that?
I'll just say that Facebook started out wanting to engage with the community and had looked at the community organizations in East Palo Alto, and it turned out there were 40 of them. And they all wanted Facebook's money. So we thought this is not the way actually to get to the community. We need to start with the community to get to the community. And that's why we brought in Deb and started working directly with the youth. And I think that really made the difference then, because it wasn't just another consultant study. The city council heard the voices of their own youth.
Back to that point of connection, right? And connectivity, about how young people, even Facebook and city leaders, really changed how their discourse was together when they had young people doing research, collecting data, right? directly in that process. So hope that answers your question a little bit.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. That's why I was really curious, because I'm wary of that, like private companies, are they invested in the community? That's a big thing.
And you should be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We want to like interchange, one person takes questions.
Let's stay with sure.
Or just stay with me.
I think you guys are ready to whatever you want.
Okay, I can start with a transportation question for the other authors. So I wanted to start off with a question that kind of frames the transportation chapter, and it's how do those case studies, those 3 case studies in the chapter, avoid tokenistic participation and move towards meaningful collaboration? And how does Y Plan really exemplify that meaningful collaboration? And how does it differ from just the normal public consultation process with the youth?
Great, and we're going to turn this over to Mandy Eppley. Take it away, Mandy.
Hi. Thank you all so much for making this work. This is so wonderful that we get to join you, even though we can't be there. That both of these are questions that, we continually grapple with as well. Like throughout the project with Facebook that you talked about, that was a conversation we were always having too, of like, let's make sure that this stays in the right direction. And I think in terms of tokenism with the students, it is always a concern in any project. And, just to back up a little bit, because we didn't get into any of the transportation projects that are in the book, in Deb's presentation, but there's a range. So in the book, the first one talked about is in New York City, and it involves students trying to brighten the Broadway corridor near their school. It started where their bus stop was closed, and they felt like it wasn't safe to have to walk past it to get on the bus and then a subway, and then they asked to open it, and the Department of Transportation said, "Oh no, that stop where you want it open, that's not safe to be, so we can't open it." And so the students, with their council member and the Department of Transportation, then said, "Okay, well, how do we make it safe? Because that's not an acceptable answer." And we had the council member and Department of Transportation involved, and then when you're talking about that break from tokenism. Once you start to get these relationships involved, where it's not about just the face of that individual, it's about actually making that change in an ongoing manner. And the project went on for 3 years, and they generated about $500,000 in that project to make changes. They created a merchants association, and they just continually pulled in more and more stakeholders, and each of the projects sort of gets there, but I don't want to go in too much. But I don't know if that answers your question, but I think it's really about building those relationships, and something that Jim mentioned as well, of like, once you show the people responsible for planning the city really what is going on in the lives of the young people, well, then they can act with it moving forward as well, and they have that with them.
Yeah, awesome. That's great. Because I remember learning a lot about Arnstein's ladder of citizen participation. So it's really good to see how that is illustrated in real life case studies. It's awesome.
All right. Another question that I wanted to ask was, you mentioned that obstacles, do come up in these projects and things. And I was wondering, in the housing section, if there was anything kind of commonplace that you found with that. And were there any particular visions that didn't really get to be carried out? Because I read them and I think, oh man, that's so awesome. But I'm sure maybe, a couple times they just can't come to be because of resources or political restrictions or things.
Dr. Cheryl Buss, take this question.
Good evening, everyone. Hello from California. So happy to be here. And I want to thank Raluca and Juana for your deep and thoughtful reading of our chapters and questioning us. You're asking excellent questions, and they're questions that we ask ourselves all the time, and try to really formulate powerful answers and really respond to these issues in our work. So focusing on housing, book, we use 3 case studies on housing. One is in East Palo Alto, which Deb and Karen spoke to, and the second one is in New York City, where they're dealing with homelessness and resources in the school campus. And the one that I'm the most familiar with and that I can speak to tonight in response to your question is in San Francisco. And it was a group of elementary school students who've been working with the housing developer in the city of San Francisco on a public housing development that is right next to the school that was being torn down and rebuilt to be mixed use as well as public housing and Section 8 housing. So it was something that, first of all, every student in the school could see it every day, the site. Second of all, many of the students lived in it. Third of all, there was tremendous community concern about the whole development process. So the developers really, really wanted to help smooth over this process because they were eager to rebuild very dilapidated public housing and very degraded public spaces. So they came together with the city of San Francisco and a lot of other resource people and Y-Plan and the university to engage 3rd, 4th, and 5th graders in the process of thinking about primarily about the public spaces within the housing development. And it was a little bit easier than engaging them in some of the high level issues of like how many units and where the streets are going to get reconfigured. Some of those other issues were pretty complex, but they did address those issues. And I'm going to get to responding to your question in a second, but I just want to say that the students worked really, really hard for several years on giving input to the developers and the architects and the landscape architects on how they thought the public parts and the open space parts and the public space parts of the development should be responsive to the needs of young people of all ages, but also seniors and people of different abilities. So these were concerns that the students engaged with the adults on. And like just about anybody involved in urban planning and architecture and government, there are many obstacles. And I think that all of them boil down to, they're common to all of our projects, they boil down to money, regulatory restrictions such as zoning and other constraints, a big one, lack of imagination, lack of will. A lot of those are obstacles that we encounter, and we really have to teach the young people how to deal with those, because those are real. Those are obstacles. Even the President of the United States encounters those kinds of obstacles. So in order to realize, to express a vision, articulate a vision, render that vision, and present it is lovely and wonderful. How does that get realized, or how do their ideas get integrated into the real project is the challenge. Many of those ideas did get woven into the development process, which was lovely and gratifying. But even if they didn't, over the years, we've found that young people also learn how to navigate, how to negotiate, how to collaborate, how to be civic activists. And I think that it really generates a sense of purpose, like Jim referred to, a sense of hope. And what they also give to the adults in this process is healing. These young people brought a contentious process between adults, a lot of contention between adults, and humbled a lot of the adults because the children kept focusing on what's going to make this development good for everyone. And they didn't get caught in the weeds of fighting, and they didn't get daunted by some of the obstacles. They just kept focusing on that. And many of the adults said, we're embarrassed. We're embarrassed that we were fighting over these issues, and the young people have been able to pull it together and collaborate and come up with a vision and offer us all optimism and hope. So yes, they encounter obstacles, but along the way they learn how to navigate those obstacles and how to collaborate. And the adults learn our 6 essentials: how to listen to young people, how to come to a mutual understanding, how to use real tools to navigate through these obstacles, and how to bridge various gaps. So there's a lot of learning that goes along the way that may not result in the perfect public park or public space or perfect housing development, but those are some of the riches that we all reap in the process. And especially over time, we've been working in this neighborhood for almost 13 years now, and we start to see ideas that were inchoate ideas maybe 12 years ago have started to gain traction and start to be realized and start to be woven into not only the housing development, but other public space developments in the neighborhood. So yes, there are a lot of obstacles. Yes, it is frustrating. Yes, it is long-term. In our very first year, the children asked the landscape architects, how many years is it going to take to realize this project? And the landscape architect said, oh, about 10 years. And you should have seen the crestfallen look on their faces. That's like my whole life, and they couldn't fathom it. But over time, those kids are now in their mid-20s. They're able to look back and see, their footprints and their handprints on the development in their own neighborhoods and in the public spaces surrounding their neighborhoods. So it's a long-term process, and there are a lot of obstacles. And thank you for asking that very thoughtful question, Raluca.
That was a fantastic response. I have no follow-up.
We'll talk later.
Okay, I'll carry on with my next question. So the book talks a lot about how the process of youth engagement leads to not only transformation changes in youth identities, but also the systems that govern their communities. So my question is, how do youth civic engagement programs ensure that these changes are long-term and not just short-term changes?
That's great. I'm going to turn to my colleagues here. You want me to take it? Or Mandy, you want to take it?
It's a hard one. You ask good questions. Yeah, and it's interesting, as Shro was talking about the long-term nature. I mean, the other transportation, the project at the end in the transportation section is the Oakland Project, where students were working on the BART station and making that more kind of central to their community. And one thing that came out of it was a mural that they designed, and it took 3 years to get the mural implemented. And 3 years of 3 months from now, sort of. So, we did the spring project, they did the internship in the summer, and they wanted the mural unveiled in September. That was 2017. And then it was delayed till December. And then it was delayed till the summer of 2018. And it was eventually unveiled in the summer of 2020, in the middle of the pandemic, and it's socially distanced, and we had masks, and there were wildfires, so we couldn't breathe. But it was such a different context, and everyone came back to the project. The students who worked on it, the planners who worked on it, the people who worked for BART, the people from our team, many who'd moved on, college students who had moved on. And so I say that to, one way that this sustains, and I'm going to say another, but one way that this does sustain is that it is so impactful on the individuals involved that they persist in making sure that that project still came through even 3 years later, which, it would have been easy for the BART, it was the planner in charge of arts at BART, and it would have been easy for her to, oh, that fell off, let's move on. But she wouldn't let it go. She said, no, this has to happen. This has to go through. So one way that it does is that it gets that level of care and buy-in that you don't always see in projects. Another interesting way that, and I don't know if Deb, if you would, or Karen would like to speak more, but actually the Epappa Project, is an example of when the students then become members of boards moving forward, and their voices are continually brought into the table. And, Deb alluded to, they came back to present that a couple years later, but they also got, youth representatives on committees to try to pull that forward. But, a lot of it is dependent on trying to change the mindsets of the planners involved and the processes by which they're working, so that they are continually looking to young people for ideas, and that they're continually revisiting some of the ideas they learned from this set of young people in their forward planning.
I'm going to add a quick thing to that, because the greatest challenge is also the greatest area of opportunity with this work, which is that we're sort of the problem, the adults, right, who see ourselves as expert, right, and aren't always humble enough to say, oh, I really need to learn something different. That mindset issue that Mandy talked about. When the relationships develop over time, there's that commitment. It's like the BART art director. If she didn't have the relationship with these young men who she was working with, I don't think she really would have taken on to the next mile, right? And so we don't build enough of that social relationship and connection in education or in planning, right, in our city. So the greatest challenge is, how do we get adults to feel like it's okay to screw up, to learn new things, right? And then move forward together. That's right. The biggest thing that kids love is when adults say, oh, I messed up, right? And yet it's so important, because if we can be vulnerable, then they can be vulnerable. And when you're talking about social change and physical change, you have to be allowed that space for risk and vulnerability.
That's a great answer. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll go on to my next one. I was really interested in, there's the mention of like policymaking processes in housing and how, there's urban sprawl, lower income communities are being pushed out of downtown areas more. I was really interested if you could elaborate more on how lived experiences inform the more statistics-driven part of policymaking. Like, is there a way to implement lived experiences in a more structured way, a more sustainable way, like for the long haul? And did the lived experiences that people put forward, did they confirm the statistics? Did they revise them a little bit? And in what ways? That's like a multi-part question, but hope that makes sense.
Again, a hard one, so I'm going to turn it over to Cheryl. How about, do you like an answer, but do you want to try?
It's a fabulous question and really deep and thoughtful, and I'll try to, I know we're coming up on the end of our hour, but I'd like to give it a little whack here. First of all, it is very powerful when students do bring statistics, do bring data into the equation, especially because they often look at things through a different lens, through a different perspective, and they back it up. For example, during the pandemic, a lot of students did research on the mental health of young people during the pandemic, and brought it, from their lived experience, but actually quantified it in data. So that was very powerful. On the other hand, to respond to your question, it's extremely powerful for adults to actually listen and open up their hearts to the content of what young people are saying, especially when young people are given a platform upon which to express heartfelt feelings of pain, feelings of anger, feelings of disenfranchisement, but also their hopes and dreams and aspirations. It really inspires planners and number crunchers when young people do come into that arena. A good example was a group of fourth graders came into the San Francisco planning department, and the planning department had been sitting in this meeting where everybody was droning on and on about statistics and lot lines. And I just thought, we're sending the children into a nightmare. We're sending them off the edge of the cliff. And the young people did not know, of course, what they were coming into. And they brought their models in, they brought their hopes, their dreams, and they spoke of their lived experience to these planning commissioners. And shockingly, the commissioners got up off the dais, which was like elevated a foot above everybody and 20 feet away from everybody, came down off it, came down and joined the young students, looked at their models, listened to them talk, went way past the allotted time that the kids were supposed to be speaking, and said things like, you remind us of why we are doing this job. You remind us of how important it is. For other people who encounter the lived experience and the articulation of the lived experience through both the pain and hardships, but also the hopes and dreams, it's a badge of honor when they show evidence of integrating young people's ideas and thoughts into their other statistics and data and works in progress. For example, the 2040 general plan in San Rafael incorporated in their written plan all of the words and all of the visions and hopes of young third graders. And they showed pictures of the kids and everything. And it was like a badge of courage. Like, we engaged with these young people and we actually incorporated some of their ideas into our general plan. And sometimes, even though children can't document it, especially I work with the youngest children, they can't always document everything in language that adults can understand, but they do talk passionately about equity, about mobility, about accessibility, about community connections, person-to-person connections, and most important, color and fun. And they speak a language that goes right to the hearts of almost everybody, because that's what people want for our cities, is all of those ingredients. So yes, the data is really important, and we're really glad people are collecting it. We love to encourage our young people to collect that data. And we also love to render that lived experience with lots of spotlights and sparkles coming out of it, so that people can really remember why we're doing what we're doing as planners, designers, and architects. So thank you again, Raluca, for another great question.
Yeah, I was going to jump in there. Great question, and because we need the stats, for legitimacy. The council, the mayor, the electorate, the media, they all want the stats. So the problem is that we go backwards. We typically collect the stats, and then we go and get a quote from lived experience to validate the stats. And what we learned in the East Palo Alto case was that you have to go the other way around. So we started with the youth, and we walked around every block in East Palo Alto with the high school students, and they showed us where people were living in garages, and they showed us where people were living in cars, and they showed us houses that were abandoned. And then we could develop some hypotheses, and we could go and look and find the data that would validate and demonstrate what they had told us to look for. So that's really how we ought to be doing our empirical work.
Thank you, Karen. Very nicely said.
And I would just add that I think it's important to get away from that dichotomy of quantitative or qualitative data, one privileging another, right? Some people are, oh, we need the stats, or we need the personal experience. It kind of goes back to needing both, right? We need with and, because they really tell different stories, right, of how young people are experiencing places, but how adults, how planners have to understand patterns shown by numbers, but depth showed by people.
So I want to go quickly to a question that's come in online, which Lara's going to share with us.
Okay, this question is from Tira. Y Plan just celebrated its 20th anniversary last year. Where do you see Y Plan heading in 2040?
Great. I'll take that one. That's a great question. It is honestly these types of conversations. So we're at a milestone point where we had the privilege of writing down 20 years of our memory. We are currently trying to figure out, how do we help support this work moving forward? We are spending this year putting 20 years of curriculum, of best practices, of case studies online to be publicly accessible. So we really want to learn how to put this out there in the world. New partnerships like at School for Cities and working with OISI. That's where we see this work. Inspiring change, learning from others locally and globally, but really, listening to what's needed moving forward and putting it out there, is making it far more accessible. But then also you have to make it believable. So we're trying to do videos and much more kind of storytelling about the work.
So Juana, did you want to? I think this might be our last question. So
our last question. Okay, it's good because Cheryl and Karen, you've answered my previous question about how planning and transportation planning is really a technocentric, expert-driven process, and how Y Plan really tackles the barrier for youth engagement for that. So my last question is more of a forward-looking question as well, and that what comes next after this? So how can we apply the Y Plan strategy to larger scale planning projects or transportation planning projects, and what are the ways the cities can permanently ensure that the youth are integrated into planning processes?
Maybe Karen and I can both take parts of that question. I think it goes to what we were just saying about the next steps. It's about making the work much more accessible. We've been doing it at Berkeley and in pockets. We want to make it much more public, if you will, much more accessible, and make it simple. It's not simple, but it's doable, right? So you start small. So here in Toronto, we've been talking about starting a project with maybe 2 or 3 teachers. And then the teachers become the champions. And 1 or 2 planners that maybe work on a project, they become the champions of this work moving forward. I'm city planners and teachers have something in common, which is you can't really tell them what to do, right? You can engage them in a process and then they build the ownership. So that's what we say, go small to go fast moving forward. And we're excited to continue to figure out how to do that.
Yeah, so at the School Cities, we have a long list of problems that we want our young people to address for us. And so, it's really then about, as Deb just taught us yesterday, as we met to pick her brain about this, it's really about finding the champions in the school district. So those of you who are out there, TDSB, we want to hear from you. We would love to work with a couple teachers or in Peel region or wherever you are. We'll come to you with the problems. And then I think, Deb has the curriculum, Center for Cities and Schools has the curriculum online, and we can actually scale this up through the whole region, which is really exciting. And we will bring Oisy in to help us do it wisely and with a lot of forethought.
The biggest thing is tapping into the young people, because as we talked about, whether it's in East Palo Alto or in China or in Tohoku, Japan, where we've worked, there is no greater champion for this work than young people, right? Believing that they make a difference, right? You want cities to change. They see the hope and the ideas in young people. They figure out how to do it.
So with that, I'm going to wrap up. I want to say a big thank you to our 3 panelists, Deb Mccoy, Cheryl Buss, Mandy Eppley, and a big thank you to Jim for being our respondent and discussant tonight. And you guys are rock stars. Raluca and Juana, thank you so much. You're so brave. Gosh. And great, hard questions. Keep it up. So thank you all, audience here, audience out in the ether, and hope to build a movement here.
Yeah, and I want to thank you to the School of Cities, Karen, Laura, and all the amazing team that made tonight possible. Thank you. Yay.